It's now my privilege to introduce Deputy Secretary Adrianne Todman. Adrianne Todman is the 12th Deputy Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, where she's served as part of the Biden administration since June 2021. Deputy Secretary Todman was previously the Executive Director of DC Housing Authority and was the CEO of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, NARO. And by the way, we welcome the delegates from NARO who are joining us virtually for the conference. We look forward to seeing you back in person next time. Deputy Secretary Todman also served in several career positions at HUD, managing a $500 million grant competition focused on the redevelopment of distressed public housing sites, and is a policy aide in both the Office of Public and Indian Housing and the Office of the Secretary. She serves on numerous expert committees. Please welcome Deputy Secretary Adrianne Todman.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that very kind introduction. And I would like to thank Crystal and also Cindy Campbell for helping pull this together. Isn't technology amazing? It's just wonderful. It's just wonderful. Let's hear for technology when it works. Really good. And Crystal is right. I am very proud that HUD has created this climate action plan and that we've participated in our first climate change gathering. And, we worked really hard on that, and Crystal represented us very, very, very well. My thanks as well to all the members of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. And let me do a shout out to all my former NARA colleagues who are watching also. I'm grateful for the chance to be with all of you today, to join leaders and advocates who help expand housing stability and sustainability in their communities. And I'm honored that we're making a little bit of history together. I am told that this is the first time ever that a US official has participated in Australia's National Housing Conference. I find that hard to believe, but I'm happy to make history along with you all, and I wish I could be there in person. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the tragedy that has struck Australia's southeast coast this week. My thoughts go out to the tens of thousands of people who've had to evacuate their homes due to the devastating floods. And I mourn the tragic loss of life, myself and the Secretary both. And we stand in solidarity with all of Australia during this very, very difficult time. Today, I want to talk to you about the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, as we call it, in the context of resilience, connection, and transformation. And let me ask a question right now. How many of you have ever traveled to the United States and seen some of our housing here? Okay, a fair amount of you. Good, good, good. So hopefully some of this sounds familiar and this is a renewed knowledge for you. These themes are particularly timely because we're continuing to grapple with them here in our country. Let me say a little bit about HUD and building off of what Crystal just discussed. For nearly a century, even before HUD was established, homeownership and community development have been priorities of America's national policy. For example, the National Housing Act of 1934 established the Federal Housing Administration, creating a federally guaranteed mortgage insurance program and opened up the door to homeownership for millions of Americans. Since its inception, FHA, now a part of HUD, has insured more than 52 million single-family homes and 69,000 multifamily and healthcare facility mortgages. In 1965, President Johnson signed the Housing and Urban Development Act, expanding funding for existing federal housing programs, assisting in the construction of more housing for people with low incomes, and providing funding for public works and more. When President Johnson signed the law that established HUD, he said this, and I quote, "We must make sure that every family in America lives in a home of dignity and a neighborhood of pride and a community of opportunity and a city of promise and hope." To this day, HUD remains committed to our mission to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality, affordable homes for all. While HUD has been empowered to different degrees across presidential administrations, the department's charge to implement federal housing policy has remained consistent. President Biden recognizes the importance of a strong HUD and robust federal investments in housing. His fiscal year 2022 budget request turned the page on decades of disinvestment and put housing at the center of the administration's efforts to build a stronger, more resilient, and equitable nation. We are expecting an even stronger 2023 budget request in the coming weeks. The president's proposed $150 billion for affordable housing in his Build Back Better Act would be the largest investment in affordable housing in the US history, and we are still working on those housing investments. So under President Biden and his administration, under the leadership of my boss, HUD Secretary Marsha Fudge, we recognize the importance of and are fighting for strong national investments in our entire housing ecosystem. We also know that an empowered HUD and strong national housing policy, we can increase equity, remove barriers to homeownership, expand the national housing supply, and keep people housed. And that is the commitment of this administration that I am so proud to serve in. Let me now turn to resilience, connection, and transformation. First, resilience. In many ways, this work is more important now than ever before. COVID-19 has devastated communities across the United States. And this administration is doing everything we can to help vulnerable people weather the pandemic. Our federal government has now delivered more than $46 billion in emergency rental relief for renters who are struggling across the country. HUD has worked with our federal partners to empower our stakeholders with the guidance they need to access these rental funds. We've also called on state and local jurisdictions to pursue all actions to safeguard residents, including allowing evictions for non-payment of rent only after landlords and tenants have sought out emergency funds. HUD has also taken our own steps to help struggling homeowners with our Federal Housing Administration insured mortgages to help them stay in their homes. This includes expanding forbearance options for families who need them and reducing monthly principal and interest payments of those households in greatest distress by as much as 25%. We've also required our local housing authorities and owners who take part in our rental assistance program to provide tenants facing eviction of non-payment for rent with additional time so they can secure this important rent relief. And thanks to the President's American Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion relief package, HUD stood to make up to $5 billion programs available to over 650 state and local governments to reduce homelessness and increase housing stability. This program provides funding for rental housing development, acquisition and the development of non-congregate shelter, tenant-based rental assistance, and supportive services. Also through the President's American Rescue Plan, we provided nearly 70,000 housing vouchers to local housing agencies to help rehouse our homeless neighbors across the country. To help communities deploy these resources to maximize impact, HUD launched a new initiative that we call House America. Our initiatives will empower state, local, and tribal leaders to put our nation on the path toward ending homelessness using these unprecedented investments. House America provides communities with the focus, the resolve, and technical know-how to leverage American Rescue Plan and other federal resources to address the homelessness through Housing First, a proven evidence-based approach that connects people experiencing homelessness with permanent supportive housing without preconditions or barriers to entry. This administration understands we cannot return America to the position we were pre-COVID-19 and grappling with a crisis in affordable housing. Even before the pandemic, nearly 18 million households spent more than half of their incomes just to pay their rent or their mortgage. This figure represents roughly 1 out of every 7 families here in the United States. And we know that the pandemic made the situation far worse. Right now, it is hard to find an affordable home than at any other point since the 2008 financial crisis. Advancing housing opportunity is a priority of the Biden-Harris administration. We recognize that America needs to make serious supply-side investments to address our affordable housing crisis. And we need to bring our existing stock of affordable housing into the 21st century. That's why HUD has taken action to increase housing supply and access to affordable housing. Let me give you some examples. Last year, HUD restarted something that's called our Housing Finance Agency Risk Sharing Program with our partners at the Department of Treasury to develop more affordable rental homes. This program allows HFAs, which are state-chartered nonprofit organizations that provide financing and services for affordable housing and community development activities. This provides HFAs to obtain Federal Housing Administration insurance, so multifamily mortgages they can underwrite, with HUD and HFA sharing the risk of any potential loss. FHA, the part of HUD that provides mortgage insurance on loans made by FHA-approved lenders, anticipates that approximately 20,000 affordable rental homes will be created or preserved through the program into 2027. HUD has also made more single-family homes available to individuals, families, and nonprofit organizations, rather than large investors, by prioritizing homeownership and limiting sales to large investors of certain of our insured properties. These actions are part of the administration's plan to create, preserve, and sell nearly 100,000 additional affordable homes for homeowners and renters across the country over the next couple of years. As HUD continues to act in its administrative capacity to unlock and create more housing supply, we're also looking for historic investments in American homes. These investments would transform American lives and help millions of households to pay their rent and to buy their first homes. The pandemic underscored the need for every person to have a safe, stable place to call home. And we are working toward that every single day. At the same time, we're also working to meet urgent pandemic-related housing needs as our nation continues to grapple with more frequent and intense natural disasters, and Crystal laid out some of those, and other impacts of climate change, from floods and hurricanes to wildfires and earthquakes. You know, the new scientific report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change certainly detailed the scope and severity of the global climate crisis, and it's a wake-up call for all of us. According to the report, the cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Those are heavy words, and they're significant. Unless we quickly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change's impacts, we will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for us and our children and our children's children. At HUD, we are working to confront the climate crisis on multiple fronts. We know it's just not enough to build back from disasters. We have to build resilient communities that can withstand more intense natural disasters and assist vulnerable communities in mitigating disasters before they strike. That's why, just in January, HUD opened access to $2 billion in disaster recovery funds, with a requirement for communities to directly incorporate mitigation as a core component of regular disaster recovery, instead of treating it as a distinct activity. We are also requiring communities to advance equitable distribution of disaster recovery assistance. We know that Americans of color are disproportionately threatened by climate change and extreme weather. We are more likely to live in low-lying areas at greater risk of flooding. And we are more likely to live in communities that lack parks, gardens, and other green spaces that could absorb surging storm waters. Equitable resilience is also a core component of HUD's climate action plan that Crystal described. It's an agency-wide strategy to advance climate adaptation and resilience, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and deliver environmental justice. With this plan, HUD will guide the integration of climate resilience and environmental justice into HUD's core programs and policies, putting our department and housing at the center of efforts to protect our communities and tackle the climate crisis. What becomes quite clear when you think about resilience, whether it's the pandemic or climate change, is the importance of connection. Connecting people to the supportive services they need, connecting HUD with other federal partners to coordinate our responses, connecting with state and local partners to identify needs and deliver resources. At HUD, we recognize that housing is foundational to improved outcomes in all areas of life. We are working to strengthen the connections that we facilitate through these improved outcomes. We are focused on improving access to long-term services and supports for populations and HUD-assisted households that need more intense wraparound care, such as older Americans, people with disabilities, and people experiencing homelessness. Just recently, we launched a joint Housing and Services Resource Center with our partners at the US Department of Health and Human Services, I'll call them HHS, to coordinate information sharing and technical assistance around these issues and populations. Building upon our efforts to make it easier for HUD-assisted households to access pandemic vaccines, we are working with the HHS to improve health and services access to HUD-assisted residents more broadly. This work will focus on improving healthcare coverage and connections to primary care for HUD-assisted households through their community health centers. As part of the administration's effort to address the racial disparities in maternal health outcomes, we will also be working with them to ensure that pregnant women in HUD-assisted households are aware of and connected to their maternal health programs. As part of our national AIDS strategy, HUD will be working with the Ryan White program to bring HIV/AIDS education, prevention, and treatment to people living in our public social housing and also other HUD-assisted housing. The pandemic has also taught us about the importance of ensuring that HUD's housing programs are included in broader public health efforts. We are exploring strengthening our partnership with the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, to improve collaboration between public housing authorities, HUD-assisted housing owners, homeless service organizations, and health and local public departments. These collaborations would encompass everything from pandemic preparedness, reducing childhood-led exposure, to healthy homes to address homelessness. Finally, we are working to help HUD-assisted residents to build assets and achieve greater financial independence. For instance, we see great opportunity in the expansion of a program that we call Family Self-Sufficiency. And it's a program that enables HUD-assisted families to increase their earned income while they live in our assisted properties. As we advance these efforts, HUD is doing so with the overarching goal to pursue transformative housing and community-built policies and programs. We are committed to centering our focus on people and their lived experiences, with policy and programs that are equity-focused and advancing housing justice. One of our most transformative efforts relates to home appraisals. We know that homeownership is a key tool to building intergenerational wealth. Yet too many Black families here in America fail to experience the same benefits of homeownership as white families. Bias in the appraisal market represents a major part of the problem. The value of my home and the rate at which it grows should not be determined by the color of my skin. Yet studies have found that homes in largely white neighborhoods are appraised at values that are nearly 25% higher than similar homes in largely Black neighborhoods. And the president said, "We cannot let this stand. We will not accept this." And so he assembled a task force that's charged with eliminating this discrimination from our appraisal market. This task force brings together partners from across the federal government. It focuses on property appraisal and valuation equity. We call it PAVE for short. It is the first such effort in our history, and I'm proud to say that our Secretary, Marcia Fudge, serves as its co-chair. This program is just one part of the administration's efforts to close the racial wealth gap by expanding housing opportunities for people of color. In recent years, America's homeownership gap between Black and white families have reached its widest point since 1968, and that's when banks could still legally discriminate against borrowers based on the color of their skin. A big reason behind the homeownership gap is the burden of student debt carried by millions of Americans, a burden that is particularly heavy for people of color. According to Brookings, which is a prominent American research institution, the average Black college graduate owes nearly twice the amount of student loans as the average white graduate. HUD is determined to help more Americans with student loans to realize their dreams of homeownership. That is why, earlier this year, we issued a new policy that makes it easier for borrowers with student debt to qualify for a federally guaranteed mortgage responsibly. The Biden-Harris administration and HUD, we are doing everything we can to help forge a stronger, more prosperous America, with housing and community development as two of the most important tools we have at our disposal. As we continue to confront the challenges before us, collaboration between nations is ever more critical. While there is no cookie-cutter approach to housing issues within a single country, let alone different countries, idea sharing and exploration is critical for innovation and improvement. HUD is proud to stand as your partner today and every day. And this administration is doing everything we can to help build a more equitable America. And we cannot do it alone. We need the help of local leaders across this country to fulfill that. From advocating for the housing agenda to advancing racial equity to championing House America. HUD is proud to stand with our partners locally and the states, and proud to stand with you. Together, we can help make sure that every American and Australian with a chance to live each day with security, with dignity, and with hope. I'm so happy to be able to join you in this historic virtual event. I want to thank you very much for inviting us to your conference and look forward to answering any questions that you have. And now I'll turn things over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Secretary. It's a truly inspiring set of observations you've opened with this morning, our time, this afternoon, your time, I should say. And a number of questions have already come through. We're taking questions through a conference app rather than by microphone for COVID-safe reasons. And for everyone watching virtually or here in the room, I'd encourage you to put questions through now for both of our speakers. Madam Deputy Secretary, I understand there are some constraints on your time this morning. Do you have a few minutes to stay with us?
I do have a few minutes.
A few minutes, thank you. Thank you very much. I do appreciate the
I'm looking forward to the questions.
Okay, I'll stop. A number of comments and questions have come through really remarking on how inspiring it is to see a federal agency taking such a strong leadership role in the housing space. Australia's system is a little different. We have a federated system of government where a lot of the responsibility for housing of vulnerable people is devolved to the states rather than to the federal government. There's a lot of curiosity about public sentiment of the expectation on federal government, but also the interaction between the federal government and state agencies and really how that works. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the intergovernment relations and how that part works.
No, that's a fabulous question, and I think this is part of our shared learning agenda. That's how we all have different ecosystems and how we support the supply of housing and who receives it. So I would say this: prior to, say, the last 10 or 15 years, the general American population did not necessarily consider affordable housing something that was of particular importance to them personally. I would say that ever since the Great Recession and since the pandemic, when so many families sadly lost their jobs and were struggling to pay their rent and mortgage, the concept of housing and affordable housing seemed to be something that only low-income families needed, so our public housing and social housing. But there's been a heightened awareness about the importance of being able to afford a place being able to afford where you live has reached new heights because of some of the distress that the pandemic and the Great Recession caused so long ago. So I will say that much like education systems wanted to have safe and strong roads and wanted to make sure that we had strong healthcare systems, Americans are now talking about the need for more affordable housing more than they ever have in the past. Now, as to the question of how we all work together, HUD's programs are, of course, funded by the Congress, and we take those programs and they range from our rental to homeownership and all points in between, and we share those funds with our state and local governments. Sometimes the same program will share funds with both levels, or sometimes some are dedicated just to the state and to the local. And then those government entities will then work together to build supply or to provide rental assistance. I will say the one agency that's not standing next to me right now that's critical to that construction is Treasury. Treasury has a tool that's called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit that is really fundamental to the creation of affordable housing here in the States. And basically, it allows for private interests to invest in the creation of affordable housing and receive a tax benefit on the end. So there's a lot of interplay, and I could stand here for some time talking about how to formulate a deal and in terms of average medium incomes and how those all work together. But it is a nice interplay. I will say sometimes it is wholly complicated, and we're trying to make it less complicated, the Secretary and I.
Thank you. An interesting question just come through around the burden of student loans. You talked quite eloquently about that burden of student loans and how HUD is working to address that. A related challenge, I guess, is around healthcare costs. And in Australia we have universal healthcare, and that covers a large part of costs of healthcare. But in your country things are a little different. To what extent are your programs engaging with that dimension of debt and cost?
Another great question. So, there is certainly a stream for affordable housing that HUD sits in. We're very fortunate to have the Affordable Health Care Act, which was created during the Obama administration, that provides for affordable health care stream for Americans across the country. The interplay is interesting. In the Affordable Care Act, there was a system created that's called a Medicaid waiver, which allows for untraditional players to the healthcare arena to be able to take some of the funds that are inside of the healthcare stream to pay for services that would be provided inside of the affordable housing stream. And how does that sort of manifest itself? We here in the States have something called permanent supportive housing. And the concept there is that we will build housing for individuals who are homeless or near homeless. And some of those services can be funded by some of the funds inside of our healthcare stream. It's a nice interplay. It is not at a scale that I think the secretary and I would like, but it's certainly an opportunity for both streams, the housing stream and the healthcare stream, to work together. And the programs sometimes are a little clumsy right now in terms of how they intersect, but we do have the opportunity to do that. I will say that the other place where healthcare comes into play is that in our assisted programs, when the cost that an individual family has in terms of their healthcare is looked at as a means to reduce some of the rent that they would pay inside of our assisted housing system. So there's an interplay there as well.
Thank you very much. One of the questions that's come through, which is of interest to me as head of a research institute, is asking about evaluation of the programs you offer. And obviously there's an enormous breadth of program that you've covered. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about evaluation of those programs, how you know they're working, and who does that evaluation?
So I have to suspect that my colleague, Todd Richardson, must be listening in and sent that question to you, because he is actually in charge of policy development and research here at HUD. So Todd, if you're listening, very, very clever of you, my friend. But yeah, we do here at HUD have a whole office that's dedicated to not just informing the policies that we're making with smart facts, but also on the back end, really testing to see whether or not our programs are doing what they're supposed to do. I will say that there is much room for improvement there in terms of starting that research at the ground level, so we're able to benchmark and capture where we were and where we're going. But we do have a whole internal arm that does do that for us. We also have other entities here in the federal government that are more on the accountability and compliance side that sometimes, whether or not we like it, will be testing to see if our programs are working as well. And those inquiries will sometimes come from our members in Congress or other persons of that like. So we do have a robust research agenda here. In fact, one of the things that this administration has done is required every single department to come up with a research agenda that says, over the course of the next year or two, here are the things that we are going to be measuring ourselves against. So that is actually a priority and a requirement of each department here in the States.
Terrific, thank you, thank you. You covered a lot in your presentation, and Crystal, I will come to you in a moment, but covered a great deal in your presentation. And as we were talking about some of the effects of the pandemic, I'm curious to what extent are programs that were rolled out as response to the pandemic, have they been a springboard for the climate action? Have they been an opportunity to test and try new sorts of programs that are then part of a climate response?
Right. I will certainly ask Crystal to speak to some of the things that she sees that we can build off of our climate, our pandemic rather, fueled resources and sort of the linkage to our climate action plan. But one of the things that we've seen is that, with the funds that we've received, and not just HUD, but states and local governments received from the Congress, there was a fair amount of creativity that was unleashed, right? Much like what we're doing right now. The pandemic, sadly, out of mother necessity, right, comes invention, forced us to do things in ways that we didn't ordinarily think that we could, and forced us to do it in a time frame that we didn't think that we could do it. And so that is the same, I think, in terms of our programs. We were very fortunate that through the President's American Rescue Plan, there were billions of dollars that state and federal and local governments could use in response. And we're seeing nuggets of innovation that are manifesting because of the urgency of using those funds to confront the pandemic that we think will be able to inform how we look at certain climate and resilient actions in the future. I will give one quick example of that. We actually, through our one of our housing programs is called Home. And it does exactly what it says. It builds homes. We're very smart here in the States in terms of how we name our programs. And it's a tool that we unleash to really say, hey, we know that there's a housing supply issue out there that the pandemic has made even worse. We want to make sure that we are building smart and building quickly. And we infused into that some expectations about how to build, looking toward the future. But I'll allow my colleague Crystal to elaborate.
Sure, thanks so much. And it's great to see you too here. I think with the pandemic, a few things became really clear. One is just the importance of home, of a house, of a place to live. I think we all saw that with everybody suddenly being home all the time. Just the importance of making sure that you have a safe, a healthy, a secure place to live became just really critical. And that highlighted a lot of the differences that we've seen between our homes that are maybe less resilient, maybe less energy efficient than those that are. And so I think that added to a sense of urgency. And then the second thing is the communities and the people that we've seen that are the most impacted by COVID-19 and the pandemic are the exact same communities that are the most impacted by climate. They're the vulnerable communities, they're the low-income communities, are the people that we serve. So I think it continued to add to this urgency and this idea of like, we need to be focused on our core mission and our core constituents or people that we serve. And that includes making sure that we're building resilient, building green. And then I think the third thing I would just say is to build on the Deputy Secretary's comment about creativity. We've seen so much creativity and big ideas around the pandemic, and some of the things that were just sort of shocks to the system, like maybe we don't all need to go into the office every day, things like that, have really opened up ideas around big thinking and creativity on every level, from climate to the economy to everything else. So I think that we've kind of given ourselves more permission to think big and to think bold and to move quickly on a lot of these things, which is why we have 105 actions in our plan. And I think we're going to move quickly on all of them. So.
It's quite a plan. Drawing on a range of the comments and questions coming in now, I guess, there's a bit of commentary around public sentiment and riding the wave of public sentiment. And I think you've seen in the last couple of days in the conference, there's quite strong public sentiment towards stronger climate action in Australia. But some of the government programs, particularly in the housing space, are trailing just a little behind that. To what extent has the pandemic and the climate crisis driven changes in public sentiment on expectations of what HUD delivers?
So let me do this. This is a great opportunity for me to pass the baton over to Crystal, and as she seeks to answer that question, let me just thank you again, Michael, for the invitation to us here at HUD. This technology worked. Invite us over again. I'm sure we can do this, and looking forward to seeing you and all of your colleagues in the room in person, hopefully the next time you have your conference. Have a good evening, everybody.
Let's take a moment to thank Deputy Secretary Todman.
Well, good morning, rather. Good morning.
Thank you. Public sentiment.
So I think that many of us in this room know the secret that housing is where it's at. It's a platform for everything, right? It's a platform for health. It's a platform for economic mobility. It's a platform for how do we make these big changes in terms of our climate and resilience. As the Deputy Secretary said, I don't know that lots of other people outside of the housing realm get that yet. They're starting to, as unfortunately there's an affordable housing crisis, and homes are getting more expensive and rents are getting more expensive. But I think that for the most part, a lot of the work is sort of under the radar that we do at HUD, including the climate work. So we have seen more of a demand for green and resilient homes. But I think that we're also the ones driving a lot of that. Unfortunately, a lot of times people who are low income, who live in disadvantaged communities, don't feel like they have a lot of choice in their options and where they live. And so we haven't seen the demand kind of from the users of HUD's programs. Hopefully we will going forward.
Let's turn to some of the climate-specific questions then. So you mentioned an 8-degree temperature difference between neighbourhoods, in part due to the nature of built environment. To what extent are HUD programs doing things like tree planting and that wider sort of impact on at a community level rather than at a dwelling level?
Yeah, it's interesting. So some of our programs are very focused on buildings, or even towards individual tenants, where we have a voucher program that you can, an individual tenant can take and go find a place to live. But we have a large part of our programs through our community development and community policy and development program that is focused on communities. And in those programs, the CDBG block grants and the disaster resilient block grants, those programs, those funds can be used towards things like building parks for the purpose of both kind of enjoyment, but also for the purposes of resilience or stormwater, swells, those kinds of things. So one of the things we've been doing this year is creating some toolkits for communities and developing a climate cohort of interested communities who are interested in thinking about how do I use some of these block grant funds to have an impact on climate in a way that maybe I hadn't thought of. So we've got some case studies and climate cohorts around green space, also around things like cool roofs, et cetera, just helping bring that knowledge into the community so that they can figure out how to use their block funds for those programs. We also partner with groups like, there's an organization called Green City Force. Green City Force is a nonprofit organization in New York City, and they partner with our New York City Housing Authority. New York City Housing Authority houses 1 in 14 New Yorkers, so it's a big agency. And as you can imagine, a lot of the buildings in New York, a lot of concrete, certain neighborhoods, not a lot of tree cover. And so Green City Force actually partners to hire New York City Housing Authority young residents, train them in programs like planting trees around the city and giving them job skills and preparing them for sort of more sustainable careers in the future. So we have a couple of different ways we try to approach that.
Terrific, thank you. There are a number of questions around domestic and family violence support programs. I'm not sure to what extent your expertise goes there, but can you talk a little bit about HUD's programs in that space?
Yeah, so in the United States, there's something called the Violence Against Women Act, and that act makes it illegal to discriminate against somebody who's a victim of domestic violence. So, things like if you have had the police called, you call the police often and they come to your house, a landlord can't use that to as a means of evicting you because you're creating a disturbance or those things like that. So HUD works very closely with partners across the federal agency to make sure that victims of domestic violence do have vouchers and places where they can go that are safe and that they're not discriminated against in terms of housing like I described because of things that may be beyond their control.
So how do the voucher programs work? People effectively have an income support that they carry with them to whichever dwelling they choose. Is that the nature?
So unfortunately, there are not nearly enough vouchers. So it's not an entitlement in the sense that if you make below a certain income, you automatically get a voucher. But if you are, and that's up to Congress and the funding that HUD receives every year. So if we have more money, we'll supply more vouchers. But the idea originally, and when it first started, many decades ago, was about housing choice. So in addition to having buildings that are all affordable housing buildings, we want to make sure that families can choose where they go, can move towards jobs, move towards opportunities, move towards good schools. And so those families that are lucky enough to win the lottery to get a voucher can take that voucher and go anywhere. As long as the rent is sort of a fair rent that is being charged and it's the right size house for their voucher, then they can use that voucher to pay the difference between 30% of their income and whatever that rent would be.
One of the comments coming through is suggesting that we've been talking largely about urban settings, and to what extent do HUD's programs deal with much more regional settings, remote communities, and the like?
So HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So you would think that we're very focused on urban, and a lot of a lot of the work we do is in urban areas, but we're really in cities and towns all across the United States. Our community development block grants go towards cities, but then they also flow down to smaller communities in many areas through states. So states can then allocate those funds to smaller communities. And we think that's growing more important, especially as some of our urban areas become harder to afford, more gentrified in many ways. Those families and those individuals who have lower incomes are being pushed further out from the city centers. I know that's a common problem here as well. It makes it harder to serve communities that are more dispersed. It also makes it harder for those individuals to get to jobs and employment centers. But we do, with those vouchers, they can still get the housing services wherever they go.
Thank you. One of the growing patterns we've seen in Australia in recent years is housing vulnerability or homelessness for older women, who typically have less superannuation savings, less savings, and so are more vulnerable to poor housing or to homelessness than similarly aged men. Is that a pattern you're seeing in the US as well?
Yeah, we are seeing one of the fastest growing areas of homelessness is senior citizens and senior women, just like in here that I heard in another session, or maybe it was the plenary. So there's a lot of there's a lot of similarities between the two countries. And
does HUD have particular programs targeting those demographics?
So we don't have particular programs tied specifically towards women, although we are working really hard at things like aging in place, making it easier for older Americans to stay in their homes and not have to move out and go toward other like nursing homes or assisted living homes, those kinds of things. So we're working on a variety of different sort of financial ways, but also physical ways, things, making it easier for older Americans to get the adaptations needed to their homes so that they continue to live in those places. Another area that's really important is that we know that a lot of older Americans are caregivers for young kids. And so making, their own grandkids in many cases. So making sure that those homes are lead safe and just safe generally for small children is really important as well.
Thank you. Turning back to climate questions, a new construction code, a residential construction code is being developed at the moment. It will be released next year. That is expected to increase requirements for green building and more resilient housing. So there are some real challenges there that are being worked through at the moment. Any advice?
We have it all figured out, right? I mean, I think it's tough. It's for new construction, at least in the United States, it's a no-brainer in many cases. In some cases, it's cheaper to build an efficient and resilient house than to not. Even just when you're talking about first costs, not even talking about the the savings over time because of utilities or the reduced insurance prices, et cetera. When you're talking about existing properties, it's hard because I think we've seen in this conference, you've got a finite pot of money, and you need to be able to make good decisions with that. And so what we've done in a lot of cases is if we're requiring, and first of all, HUD doesn't set a national building code, but we can say for programs that use HUD funds, you have to build in a certain way. Okay. And so we've done that in some ways by saying, when you have a substantial rehabilitation, you need to do these things that make sense, or require it when there's a refinance opportunity or some opportunity where there can be an influx of money that fits naturally. Because if you're trying to do it outside of those cycles, one, you might end up, replacing a perfectly good water heater or toilet or something like that when you don't want to do that. But then there's just not the financing or mechanisms available. So I think it's just finding those moments and making sure that you're incorporating the requirements in those opportunity moments.
And as I think you've observed over the last few days, one of the really important demographics we need to be concerned about in Australia is our First Nations people and housing outcomes for them that remain unacceptably low. Can you talk about some of the specific programs in the US for your First Nations people?
Sure. So we have an Office of Native American Programs as part of HUD that and our Native American tribes and First Nations have a lot of autonomy in some ways. So some of the funds go to those communities as block grants, and so the federal government has less say over what they do with those block grants. But there are a lot of places like the Île de Jean Charles in Louisiana, like in Alaska, where those Native American populations are facing the biggest existential risks to their homelands, because they're in Alaska or in the areas where there's a lot of flooding. Those communities are having to make choices about, do they relocate? Do they relocate individually? Do they stay in the land? What kind of supports do they need to stay in that area? And so HUD has a variety of technical assistance and grant programs that are designed for those communities to help them make those decisions with their community members. And whatever those decisions that they make, then HUD will then support those, to support that if they're going to stay in a particular place, what kinds of ways or what kinds of resilient building is needed, or if they're going to try to relocate, HUD will work with them to try to figure out what kind of resources are needed for that as well.
Thank you. One of the things I think you've also seen in the last few days and noticed in the support of this conference and the presence at this conference is a very strong community housing sector that continues to grow and is highly professional, highly sophisticated in its operation. I think historically in the US there's been less of that not-for-profit or for-purpose organisation working in the housing space. Is that something that's changing?
Whether they're more non-profit, sort of mission-driven, affordable housing developers, there are quite a few, and they're great partners and so important. I think what the Deputy Secretary talked about in terms of our tax credit program, that is really critical too, because that is appealing to not just nonprofit or mission-driven developers, but market rate for-profit developers as well, because they're able to take advantage of that tax credit. And I think we need all sectors for the housing crisis that we're in. So things that appeal to the nonprofits and grants, but also things that appeal to the sort of for-profit private sector as well, in order to make a difference there.
And I'm moving around quite a bit now, but there's a wide range of questions. One of the long-term patterns in Australian cities and in US cities, gentrification, where particularly inner suburbs that have been working class become gentrified and a higher income demographic move in and price out the original demographic who are displaced and often struggle for a new place to live. Is that a focus of HUD programs first, but also of the Climate and Action Plan, where displacement is a significant challenge? Is that something that you're addressing?
That is certainly a concern of HUD across the board, and we have a lot of variety of programs. It's interesting that our public housing properties, in many cases, they were built decades and decades ago, back when cities were not the place to be. And so now some of our public housing properties and affordable housing properties are actually some of the most sort of sought after real estate. So they're well positioned in that case in order to kind of remain affordable. Some of our tax credit properties, again, that's a Treasury program, not a HUD program, are facing more pressure in terms of converting to market rate. So HUD does have a variety of programs that are focused on trying to support those owners that want to stay affordable in those areas that are desirable areas.
Terrific, thank you. There are a number of other questions that are coming through the app that are highly specific, getting into the long grass, as we say here, getting into the fine detail, that I perhaps might let people follow up with you individually rather than ask in detail. And it may be more a question of referring to parts of the agency rather than to yourself, because some of them are well outside your particular space.
Absolutely, and I will just say, I think that through the app, or is there a way for people to reach me?
I'm certainly happy to help connect people, absolutely.
And if my slides have my contact information, if I don't have the answer to a question, I can certainly find the answer and find the people that I'm sure would be thrilled to speak with anyone in this room about what's probably a very similar issue that's being dealt with here in Australia. So please reach out.
And on that note, would you please thank Crystal Bergemann? Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the plenary